Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on the time zone you're in. And we have many represented today in this international event with panelists from Nigeria, Indian country, in North America, and the United States. And we're thrilled to welcome all of you. I'm Becca Economopoulos with the Natural History Museum. We're a traveling and virtual museum for the movement. And we are hosting an ongoing year-long programming series called Natural History for a World in Crisis. So today's event, Resisting the Global Land Grab, is part of that. The event series is curated by our Red Natural History Fellows. And you will hear today from Krystal Nnimmo Bassey, and our Red Natural History Fellow, Ashley Dawson, on the panel. I want to first let you know that intro music was by the Micmac artist Willie Dunn, Song of the Sun. And I encourage all of you to introduce yourselves. Let us know where you're calling in from and what it is that attracted you to today's event or what you're hoping to get out of it. I also want to thank our sponsors, the Hewlett Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, and For Culture, without whom this programming would not be possible. And last thing, a little bit of housekeeping. You will not be able to be heard, your audio as guests of the event, but you will be able to engage in the chat and also post questions for our panelists. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button, and that's where you can share questions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the Natural History Museum's Research Director, Steve Lyons, to tell you a little bit more about today's event.
Thank you, Becca. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. This is the third event in our ongoing webinar series, Natural History for a World in Crisis. So this series is about the social, political, and natural forces that have shaped the world we live in today. That is both the forces that have plundered, profited from, and poisoned the land, water, and air, unevenly driving the planet's vital ecosystems to the brink, as well as the forces that have historically and today stood in the way. And more than this, it's also a platform for scientists, scholars, organizers, activists, and community members to come together to think ambitiously about what kinds of institutions, institutional practices, and ideas we need if we are to break from the paradigm that got us into the mess we're in today. So our first event a few months ago, organized by Dene geographer Andrew Curley, took us to the Colorado River to ask how the Colorado River has transformed over the past 2 centuries of colonization, as well as how an understanding of this colonial history can reshape not only how we understand the contemporary water crisis there, but also how we collectively respond to it. And our second event, just a few weeks ago, was organized by Dina Gillia Whitaker, and it took us into the realm of implementation. And we assembled a group of conservation practitioners there who are trying in earnest to place tribal sovereignty and Indigenous knowledge at the heart of their conservation initiatives. So today we're going to zoom out to a global scale to come to grips with today's so-called green transition. So we're going to think about how multinational corporations, extractive industries, finance capitalists, and corrupt governments are seizing the green transition as an opportunity to extract more and more wealth from communities across the world, many of which are communities that have already endured centuries of colonial dispossession. But the point is not just to gain a better sense of how the powerful are taking the global climate and biodiversity crisis as an opportunity to expand their power and reach, but also to attune ourselves to the openings from which a more durable solidarities might be forged between peoples across the world who are finding themselves in the crosshairs. So Ashley Dawson is going to be your facilitator for the event today. He will lead the conversation and begin us with an introduction, followed by opening comments by Nnimmo Bassey and Krystal. We'll be dropping their bios in the chat. But as Becca has said, you're welcome to contribute to the conversation via the chat, or if you have questions for the panelists, you can submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So we will try to take a few audience questions at the end of the session. But without further ado, I'm going to send it over to Ash, who will set the stage for today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Steve. And thank you to you and Becca and the rest of the team at the Natural History Museum for making today's conversation possible. And of course, I also want to thank Nnimmo Bassey and Krystal for joining me today to talk about what I think is a very important issue. And last of all, thanks to everyone who has tuned in. So my name is Ashley Dawson. I'm a professor at City University of New York, and I'm joining from Lenape Muncie land. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our conversation, which, as you heard, has to do with green grabs and how they can be resisted. So what do we mean when we talk about land and water grabs today? I'll start off with a specific example to give you a bit of context. Last year, in the run-up to the 2023 UN Climate Conference in Dubai, news circulated of a United Arab Emirates-based company called Blue Carbon and its exploits. Linked to Dubai's royal family, Blue Carbon bought up vast swaths of forests in Africa, including a fifth of the country of Zimbabwe, 10% of the land in Liberia and Zambia, and 8% of Tanzania. Added together, this land amounted to an area the size of Great Britain, which of course is a breathtaking land grab by any measure. And all of it was done in the name of offsetting carbon emissions. Now, Blue Carbon is an admittedly shocking but not unique example of a broader contemporary phenomenon of green grabs, fake fixes, and green capitalist so-called solutions to a kind of interlinked environmental, climate, and biodiversity crisis. Already 20% of the large land deals taking place in sub-Saharan Africa are green grabs, and they often target indigenous lands. And of course, this could soar in coming years. And this is taking place not just in Africa, but across all of the continents on the planet. Governments' pledges for land-based carbon removals worldwide already add up to almost 1.2 billion hectares of land, which is about as much land as is used to grow crops worldwide today. So I think those very basic statistics underline to all of us how dramatic what is happening today really is. Contemporary fake fixes, of course, also include schemes like carbon markets and geoengineering, so-called nature-based solutions, which we're going to explore in detail in our conversation today. I would argue that not only do these fake climate fixes distract and delay from real climate action while permitting big polluters and corrupt governments to carry on with their toxic business, but they also escalate the longstanding inequalities faced by underrepresented and oppressed groups, including indigenous peoples, people of African descent, and people living in global South nations. What we face today, in other words, is a kind of new green colonialism, a form of disposition made all the more insidious since it's being carried out under the benign sounding names of nature-based solutions and community-based conservation. But there is mounting resistance to these kinds of fake fixes. In fact, just to give you one example, at the 2024 United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, just a few months ago here in New York City, Indigenous peoples from around the world called for a permanent end to carbon markets and other fake fixes. We need a moratorium on false solutions like carbon markets and offsets, they argued. We're gathered at a critical time in efforts to fight back against these kinds of fake climate fixes and the global land grabs that they perpetuate. Official bodies are currently engaged in heated discussions around Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. an relatively overlooked element of the treaty that deals with market-based approaches to mitigating climate change, including carbon pricing, carbon trading, and carbon offsets. The aim of elites, I would argue, is to create what amounts to a kind of climate stock market that will allow polluters to keep polluting while also making money from the sale of carbon credits. And these conversations are unfolding right now and are going to be folded into the United Nations climate process. So during today's conversation, we will try and place these forms of green colonialism in some historical context for you. We will also reflect critically on contemporary strategies to cope with the interlinked climate and biodiversity crises. And we will think together about the most productive strategies to resist green colonialism. The aim of the conversation, or at least the aim I had in mind in inviting the wonderful speakers that we have with us today, Nnimmo and Krystal, was to help highlight and expand contemporary forms of transnational resistance and solidarity to today's green grabs. So I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have. But before we start discussing these things, there's time for Krystal and Nnimmo to react to what I've said by way of introduction and to give us a bit of a perspective regarding land grabs and fake fixes from where they sit. So we'll start out with Nnimmo and then Krystal. So I'll turn things over right now to Nnimmo. And thanks again to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Ash. And I thank everyone for joining us in this conversation today. I particularly thank the Natural History Museum for making this possible, because we are really in a season or a time of very, very intense emergency. But let me begin by saying that when there is an emergency, it's exactly that time that we need to stay calm. It's that time that we need to stand back and reason. I believe that this is what we're going to do in this conversation, talking about how to resist the global land grab. Resistance starts from knowledge. It starts from knowing what you are resisting. It starts from knowing why this is so critical and why this is so important. I'm speaking to you from Nigeria. Right now, I'm sitting in the Niger Delta, where oil has been extracted for close to 7 decades with absolute impunity. And I will be giving a whole lot of the emphasis on what I'm going to speak in the next few minutes on the realities on the ground in Nigeria, because Nigeria is so important in Africa. It's a leader in terms of many things, including in pollution. And when I say Nigeria is leading in pollution, I'm actually talking about the international oil companies who have created a lot of pollution and reduced life expectancy in the region to such an abysmally low figure. I don't even feel like mentioning it at this moment. Now, so land grabbing, sea grabbing, and sky grabbing have been going on for quite a while now. The roots of this crisis goes back, and everything is summing up in what we experience as the climate crisis at this time. And the climate crisis, we need to understand, is not just something about geography. It's not just about erratic rainfalls or floods. It's a social crisis. It's an environmental justice crisis. It's an ecological crisis. It's a gender crisis. It's a political crisis. It's an economic crisis. And so everything comes under this crisis because the roots are many, but they're all about control of capital. It's about dispossession. It's about accumulation. It's about insistence to remain on one pathway of consumption rather than take a step back and say, no, we've done enough of this. We have to go in a different direction. And so this has been pushed, and the corporations who are pushing the wrong direction are not only doing that in terms of intensifying extraction, they're also extracting our memories and kind of filling us up with the wrong understanding of the roots of the crisis. And this is something we have to resist so that we see clearly what the problem is and what the solution must be. in my context, the crisis heightened under colonialism. And at the point we moved into the era of neocolonialism. But, if you listen to what the legendary first president of Kenya, of Ghana said, Kwame Nkrumah, he said that neocolonialism is the last stage of imperialism. But we're seeing a situation where neocolonialism is reinventing itself in many, many forms, in terms of green colonialism and all kinds of, colonialism, so that people don't seem to notice. We tend to forget that the actual root is about extractivism in a way that places the centers of extraction in complete disadvantage. In other words, expansion of sacrifice zones in very vulnerable territories that are then impacted in very serious ways when you talk about climate change. Now, as I said earlier, oil have been extracted the first commercial export of oil from Nigeria was in 1958. So oil has been extracted for more than 66 years now. And now the very first oil wells have occupied territory in the Niger Delta. They've not been decommissioned. They've not been removed. They're still there colonizing the land, if I may use that term, and taking up space that could have been used for other uses. But they are monuments. If you want to see a monument to a failed production and consumption manner, this is what you need to take a ride or a flight or come by one means or the other to the Niger Delta to see this derelict equipment and oil wells that have been left behind. And the oil corporations, the big five, the big oil corporations have converted our water bodies into drainage channels where they dispose of their waste, they spill their oils, and this is a way of grabbing our water bodies. When you convert the clean water sources into cesspits of pollution, the corporations make extreme profit because they don't have to place any care at all on the environment. So our lands are grabbed for extractive purposes, for exploitative purposes, and this in turn drives global warming because these are the things, the resources that are being extracted, that is being burned elsewhere. As Ash mentioned, the Conference of Parties, which some of us call Conference of Polluters on climate change, actually heightens the crisis and hardly offers the way out of the crisis. Every successive year, we're seeing a slide into patterns of extraction, patterns of reasoning that deepens the crisis. And so a corporation like Blue Carbon would come up and do what Ash mentioned earlier, grabbing up to 25 million hectares of African land through certain kind of agreement with government without any consultation whatsoever with the communities whose lands are being traded in this way. And so we have massive, massive loss of land. You heard about Zimbabwe, 20%, Liberia, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, 10% of their land going on for blue carbon. And, in some areas like Nigeria, you don't really hear directly about land grabbing. But I could tell you that in a state in the Niger Delta called Delta State, there's been an agreement to lease out 258,000 hectares of mangrove forests for blue carbon, for carbon sequestration. And the arrangement is almost in the same pattern of arrangement between the Nigerian state and oil companies in sharing oil revenue. And not surprising, the main players behind that land grab are the international oil companies who've polluted area for almost 7 decades and who've exploited everything in the area. So the pattern remains the same. And every move that has been made and all the debates at the climate conference is just about how to keep this petroleum civilization on life support. And it's something that we need to take note of. The Niger Delta is one of the top 10 most contaminated places on planet Earth. And just imagine millions of barrels of crude oil have been dumped into the ocean, into rivers, into creeks, into swamps. And to get a picture of how devastating this is, just imagine that 1 liter of crude oil can contaminate 1 million liters of water. It's something I said 1 gallon of crude oil can contaminate 1 million gallons of potable water. The impact is enormous. It's on all living things, disrupts the food chain, and kills the mangrove trees. Mangrove trees get suffocated because they breathe through the roots. And when the crude oil spill comes, it blocks those roots. So these trees suffocate because they can't breathe. And this is happening across the region. And now there's the same kind of trees, the ones that are surviving, that oil companies and carbon speculators want to use to receive carbon credits. And then, of course, to kind of say, well, we're doing this, so it's okay to keep on contaminating and keep on polluting. I could give you examples of the massive devastation that the region has suffered. But let me just say that, let's assume that that is pretty well known across the world. We have sometimes, there's one particular oil well blowout that happened in shallow waters on the continental shelf of the coast of Nigeria. This happened in May 2020, and it's still burning and spilling more than 4 years after it happened. In broad daylight, it's something that you can see from it. You can just see it. So it's not hidden. So the ecological crimes that accompany the land grab, the sea grab, the sky grab is something that is done so blatantly and so openly because these corporations have the power. Sometimes they're more powerful than the states. And so these agreements that you hear about carbon trading and so on and so forth, it's not as though this is done by real consent, a kind of consensual agreement by the people. It's a kind of, sometimes this is done through blackmail, as you can imagine. And so we have, for example, another example I could mention quickly is about gas flaring, giant furnaces that burn about 170 locations in the Niger Delta, burning continuously and releasing a toxic cocktail of gases, dangerous gases to the atmosphere, harming the climate and harming the people who live close to them. In 2023, it was noted that half of Shell oil company total gas flares happened in Nigeria. Half, 50%, more than 50% of the gas flare, global gas flaring happened in Nigeria. Now, it looks like there's an assault on the deltas on the African continent and also protected areas. Protected areas, the areas that have been designated as heritage zones by UNESCO. I mentioned, for example, what is going on in Uganda, in the nationally protected region, where you're having very heavy crude being extracted that is going to be shipped through a pipeline to Tanzania for export. Almost every new location of oil extraction is aimed for export. And this is something that we should always keep in mind. It's a very colonial form of extraction for export, just like it's been in other spheres. Now, we also have the assault on Okavango in Namibia, which is a very pristine biodiversity hotspot that is being assaulted by a Canadian company that is drilling there. Senegal just celebrated the first oil well. Imagine the celebration of oil well in 2024, where we do know that this is what is creating harm for our climate and creating serious problems. But that is what is happening because our country, our government, is tend to think that foreign currencies like petrodollars and foreign investment is the best way to go, and not so much about what happens on the ground and to the people. So I'm going to rush towards an end because I know my time is running. But let me just mention, as been said in many platforms, that the just transition we're looking for has to be a post-extractivist transition. We cannot. This is why the kind of transition that we're having right now that is promoting green colonialism, is promoting extraction of so-called critical minerals in places like Congo, in Latin America, in other parts of Africa. This using the same pattern to try to move from the harms that we're suffering now is just going to deepen the problem with a different coloration. So instead of having, you're going to have green colonialism, blue colonialism, but all this, as long as we stay on the extractivist pattern, then we're not going to get a different solution. We're just going to have the same climate crisis and other crises for communities who happen to be in the territories where these resources are being extracted. And now, let me just end up by saying what gives me hope about all this crisis. The communities that are being impacted, whose lands have been grabbed for either conservation activities or for carbon credits, they are not accepting this kind of thing quietly. They are resisting. And if you remember, just last year, on another note, last year, in August last year, there was a referendum in Ecuador, in Latin America, where the people voted overwhelmingly to keep the oil in the soil in Yasuni, which is a very biodiverse area. And that is a signal that the people who stay united and stay strong in resisting, they can always get a result. Now, the challenge is how to get that a referendum implemented by the new government in that country. In Nigeria, in 1993, the people of Ogoni, they were just 500,000 people at that time. They sent shell packing from their territory because of years of reckless degradation of the environment, of their sea, of their rivers, creeks, swamps, and streams. And as I speak to you, Shell is unable to go back to that territory to reopen the oil wells. So if people united with the resolve to stand in the federal, I mean, they suffered a lot of harm. So more than 2,000 Ogoni people got killed in the crisis in the early 90s, including Krystal and 8 other leaders who were executed in November 1995 for resisting the reckless operations of oil companies and the complicit Nigerian state. And so I would like to take a pause at this point that we have this clear example. We have in Norway, the fisher folks and the people in Lofoten area have fought to keep extraction of oil offshore Lofoten. And we've got a few other countries who have said no to extraction, although they could say we want the revenue from extraction. But we have to know that life is much more valuable than petrol dollars. And a safe environment in one territory is good for everyone. And destruction in one area is harmful to everyone. And so we have to keep this in mind as we go forward. I thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Nnimmo, for those really powerful words about the eco-crimes of fossil capitalism, how they're linked to green grabs of various different kinds, and also, these inspiring examples of resistance that you gave us. So let's turn things over now to Krystal Toobles. Krystal.
Thank you. Thank you, Nnimmo. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you to the folks that invited us here and have convened us. My name's Krystal Toobles. As you've seen, I believe my bio will be dropped, so I'll go ahead and just dive in for the amount of time that we have. And basically just want to name, speaking from like a US context here, given that these are the lands, that I have deep relationship with here in the so-called US. But for us, I think the story around green colonialism and land grabs really starts with the doctrine of discovery, settler colonialism, the removal of us, the original peoples on these lands, to basically get access to the land and to replace us, right? So that way they could actually exploit and extract the land for money, for power, for capitalism, right? I think it's important to understand what that process looked like here in the so-called US, because it informs what we see and what we continue to see happen in terms of green colonialism, land grabs, even US imperialism, and also false solutions, right? And so what we're seeing right now has roots and it has origins. I think we were removed, right, by the military before the US military was even the US military. I always talk about that, being a veteran myself, being an anti-war veteran, anti-militarism veteran. I think that it's important to name the military's role in green colonialism, settler colonialism, and land grabs as well. So we were removed by force by the military, right? And then even the US military started to form around Indigenous resistance. So those of us nations, myself being Oglala and Cheyenne, come from a long-standing history of resisting. In fact, we're some of the only nations that have actually defeated the so-called US military on these lands in particular, right? And so We were removed by them by force, enacting genocide in the name of exploitation, extraction, and removal of us. Then treaties were introduced to us. Treaties were only introduced to us as Indigenous peoples, and we were only named as quote unquote sovereign nations. So that way the so-called US could get access to these lands, right? And manipulate us using those treaties, just wanted to name to date, no US treaty with Indigenous nations has ever been honored. They have broken every single one of them. Massacres occurred to remove us. There were complete acts that were put into place, legislation put into place to remove us, naming the Allotment Act specifically, where each adult Native person, man specifically, was given so many acres, I believe 64 acres per person, and then anything in excess, right, excess of that after the treaties named all of this territory to be territory that we are going to be in relationship with. Then they enacted the Allotment Act, which basically, like I said, only offered 64 acres per adult male. And then anything in excess of that was basically given. That's where you see the land lotteries that happen on the plains. We see a lot of like historical Western movies that it reenact that speak to that. But all of that excess land is basically how we come across fourth, fifth, sixth generation families that own land and ranches here on our own territories, but that was part of forcefully removing Native folks from our land. Also, we're seeing the enactment of the national park system, right? So the fallacy there is that national parks were actually designated as ways to preserve the land and preserve for future generations is the narrative that we were pitched and that we're still pitched, right? But that's actually not accurate. National parks were formed specifically to remove Indigenous peoples legally from our lands. We have the Blackfeet people here that have deep relationship in our part of the landscape when it comes to the Glacier National Park. We have Yellowstone National Park, which hundreds of Native nations actually had deep relationship and connections to. And then when Yellowstone and Glacier National Park, only 2 examples were enacted, it was actually to remove us from having access to those lands, right? And from enacting our traditional lifeways. Boarding schools, when it was deemed unsuccessful that they are able to successfully remove us from our land, they are also unsuccessful in colonizing us fully and having us assimilate. And so the best way to actually get at the land, the best way to actually remove us from that relationship to land was to go at our children and to really target the future. The best way to remove a people from existence is to target the children, our very ability to exist into the future. And so boarding schools were basically propped up. They were models that were modeled off of basic training in a military format, ran by the church during that time frame, and actually where these boarding schools happened to be originally were on reservations, but they actually determined that it wasn't effective enough because we were still close to our community, still close to our people. And so then, boarding schools were built in locations that were far from our traditional homelands. And so Carlisle boarding school being one of the first in Pennsylvania. And so my people in particular on the plains were shipped over on trains to Carlisle, where they were actually forced to cut their hair. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They were sexually abused. They were violated. They were shamed. They were guilted. And basically the motto during that time was kill the Indian, save the man. Which probably was one of the most single effective campaigns by the US to assimilate us, to eradicate us, and also to gain access fully to the land with very little resistance after that. All of that is the predecessor to what we're experiencing now when it comes to green colonialism and land grabs, all of which happened. We went from, being part of the land and having that deep relationship across millions and millions of acres of the entire so-called United States. At that time, there was no borders. And so even our relatives to the south, relatives to the north, were also part of that. And so just to say that we were forcibly removed from the land to the point that we, now are only barely 1% of the total population in the so-called US. And we also only have a very small percentage of our original land base that we were in relationship with. The way that we're seeing this play out, and I think what's really important to understand in the US context is that, I just broke down US settler colonialism in the way that we experienced it in a very, very summarized version very quickly. But it's important to understand that it starts with the doctrine of discovery, right? Which came from the papal bulls, came from the church, basically saying that lands can be claimed on behalf of the sovereign if there are no Christians on those lands, right? And so basically that was what opened the door. That is the predecessor of Manifest Destiny here in the so-called US, this saying that it is settlers' God-given right to get access to these lands. And it is also the predecessor of eminent domain, which we still currently see happening and being called into to gain for corporations and the US government to gain access to more lands, right? Is they will name eminent domain and then they will just take control of whatever lands regardless of who it is, right? Whether it's Indigenous folks, Native folks, or even ranchers, right, that own those lands. And so that is the predecessor of it. But it's important to understand that that was enforced by the US military, but that process, right, of invading lands, removing the Indigenous peoples, replacing them with settlers fully, and that being enforced by the US militarism is what basically manifested into what we now see as the US empire, US imperialism. For the US to go overseas to other Indigenous nations and to be able to stake claim there using the US military to invade under the name oftentimes of democracy or under the name of mutual aid, and so they invade and then they gain access to those lands. They continue to exploit, they continue to extract. But what's important here and the way that we see it play out today is that capitalism is on behalf of corporations and corporatism, right? It's not on behalf of the United States government, because what happens is that those corporations are able to gain full access over there. They then pump money, billions of dollars into our political campaigns, where our politicians and our representatives who are supposed to represent us, the people, start making decisions on behalf of corporations. And that is what keeps us at forever wars. That is what keeps corporations in money. That is what keeps corporations invading Indigenous people's lands and continuing to extract and to exploit. Right? So we're seeing these processes. That is a very simplified version, right, of how we understand US imperialism, settler colonialism, all of these things, right? But I like to summarize things and condense them down because it's important for us to understand that historical context of what led us here. And then what we're seeing today happen as well, right? With the US military, US imperialism, corporatism, and capitalism, right? I think it's important also to hold that despite that there is a lot of hope. Listening to Nnimmo, I definitely 100% agree with everything that is being named there. And also, despite global warming, despite the extreme natural disasters that we are experiencing firsthand in Indigenous communities, and we are some of the first ones because we actually some of our communities live off of 100% sustenance. Right? My community is also a community where a lot of our community still hunts. We actually don't have hunting regulations on our land. We're actually able to do that naturally based on our traditional knowledge of hunting and of the ecosystem that we live in. We still have water, fresh, clean water that comes out of the earth through springs. I haul water from those springs into my home. We actually have some of the highest air and water quality standards in the so-called US. We're also able to still harvest food from our lands, right? And I think that it's important to note that because that is what we are fighting for, right? In shifting gears into the more positive side of this in terms of resisting green colonialism, resisting land grabs, and what some of the solutions are, is that land back is one of the primary solutions that I organize around and my team organizes around, primarily because we believe that is one of the only solutions to actually have an earth that is inhabitable moving forward. Indigenous peoples, in the way that oftentimes I encounter when I travel internationally and across the so-called US and to the north, to the south, is that we have teachings that come from our ceremonies and our language that tells us we are the land. We are not simply in relationship to, we are not simply, owners of land. We are not simply trying to protect the land, but we are the land. What happens to the land happens to the people. And we see that happening constantly and consistently to date, right? And so it's important that if we are to have an earth that is inhabitable, then it only makes sense for the original peoples to be the ones that lead us in that direction. We hold that knowledge still, despite massacres, beside attempted genocides, besides settler colonialism, militarism, boarding schools, all of the things that were thrown at us, disease, biological, chemical warfare against us, right? We are still holding that knowledge. We still maintain that to date, those teachings, those practices. We were fully thriving, healthy societies in economies, right, prior to settler colonialism. And so it's important to understand that as we fight for land back and we reclaim ourselves and we reclaim our relationship to land, that we are actually reclaiming everything stolen from us through the settler colonial process, right? So it's looking at, how do we reestablish our relationship to land? How do we reestablish language, ceremony, culture, spirituality? But on top of that, how do we reestablish the governance structures that we had pre-colonialism, right? The healthcare structures, the housing, the food, the legal structures, all structures in today's US society that are failing the people, right? Those are all failing us. Why do we have housing crisis? Why do we have to pay so much and put ourselves in debt for healthcare simply just to be taking care of our bodies, right? Why do we have a legal system that now currently with the rulings in the Supreme Court is ineffective in serving the people, right? Why do we have a government that is not actually uplifting the people, but is actually uplifting corporate greed and corporatism and capitalism and profit over people and over humanity and over our ability to even have an earth that's going to be livable for all people, right? And so when we organize and when we resist as Indigenous peoples, we don't do that just for ourselves. We do the work on behalf of all of humanity, all peoples. At Standing Rock, which I was there organizing, when we organized there, yes, it was to fight to have access and to prevent our water from being contaminated by a pipeline. But it wasn't just for us. It was for all people that depended on that water downstream as well, right? So when Indigenous peoples fight and we protect the lands that we have relationship to and that we come from, right? All people benefit. And this is a fact. Our relatives over at the Indigenous Environmental Network released a report that basically mapped out the impacts of Indigenous resistance, right? And now we have a new wave. I'll wrap up here. We have a new fight coming. Not only are we continuing to fight extraction through the fossil fuel industry, now we have to continue to organize around green colonialism. Because what the Biden administration here in the so-called US and globally are fighting for is they are naming a green transition, right? And they are pumping billions of dollars into what they are naming is going to be a green transition to electric, right? Well, where do those raw minerals and those resources come from for that transition? I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's a pretty high percentage of those resources and those minerals are either on Indigenous lands globally or within a 35-mile radius of our lands, which I would dare to guess are still part of treaty lands originally. And so it's important that we pick up this fight because now when we go to resist, not only are we fighting these corporations, we are now being put in a position to resist critical infrastructure because money is being pushed into these projects by the so-called US government, right? And so it's really an interesting time that we're living in right now, continuing to resist land grabs, right? And continuing to resist green colonialism when we are being inundated with a narrative like the national park system that says this is for the benefit of everyone, that this is actually going to be the answer. But really what it is just another false solution. And the only solution that I see moving forward is for Indigenous peoples to be back in deep relationship and back and having access and say in how we manage that land. And that's putting Indigenous lands back into Indigenous hands. So I'll close there. Thank you.
Thanks, Krystal, for that brilliant and incredibly rich analysis of the history of settler colonialism and how it's related to land dispossession and attempted genocide, and then how people are resisting today. So important. And there's so much I could ask you both about from your incredibly important interventions. But I think I'll focus on conservation because the effort that the Natural History Museum is involved in is called Red Natural History. So it's thinking about natural history and possible radical alternatives within natural history. Krystal, as you pointed out, conservation historically in the United States was linked to attempted genocide and land dispossession of Native people. So I wanted to just ask about a contemporary example of neocolonial conservation and ask you both to comment on it. And that is the 30 by 30 initiative. For folks who aren't familiar with that, this is an initiative which was adopted at the United Nations Global Framework on Biodiversity Conference in 2022. And the idea is to set aside 30% of the planet's surface, and that includes land and water, as protected areas by 2030. Now, some people have called that a massive land grab. I wonder if both of you think that is an accurate assessment, or if you see any possibility to work within contemporary forms of conservation and to kind of radicalize conservation to overturn some of the forms of dispossession and the crimes that you've detailed in your presentations. So I'll leave it open to whichever one of you wants to pick that question up about 30 by 30 and run with it.
Krystal, would like to go first? Okay. I think the whole idea of 30 by 30 is outrageous. Because, I mean, how do you, whose territory are you going to designate a protected area, and with whom did the system have the conversation that they want to take up 30% of our water bodies, of the land surface of planet Earth for conservation? Conservation for what purpose? This is the question, this is the thing. As Krystal was saying, he said, we don't own the land, we are the land. You know, there's this organic connection between people and the environment. We're all relatives. We're not like we're super beings, and so even for humans to decide where to damage and where to protect is a very preposterous idea. Because thinking that we can determine what we do with territories. Our peoples have lived within their environment in very respectful relationship. And in fact, you know, there's never been a case of anybody trashing the environment, so that the whole idea of conservation is very colonial in itself, because the idea came up after the colonial extraction and plunder. They found that they had almost taken everything, so they had to start protecting. And now what they were protecting was the area that our peoples were already protecting, I mean, living in. And so, you know, it's an idea that should never have been brought up in the first place. The thing that is needed is for us to recognize that we can live in a way that is in harmony with Mother Earth, with nature. And then we won't have to face all the crises we are confronting today. Conserving, in quotes, 30% of the land mass or the water bodies is just a way of saying, well, we can keep on going with the petroleum-led civilization. We can keep accumulating. We can keep consuming without end. We can keep extracting, expand the sacrificial zones, provided we have this segment that we box and we've kept it so well. This is so annoying. In Africa, they get our governments to agree to some of these kind of crazy ideas about what they call conservation without consultation with the communities. And governments, after a while, will begin to give licenses to trophy hunters to come shoot the elephants, shoot the lions, shoot the beautiful, peaceful animals. And then the communities and the people are denied access even into the areas that they've kept and maintained for centuries. So the whole idea is a crazy idea. It's an idea to maintain the unequal systems in the world. It's the idea for those who are controlling power. It's a very violent idea. And I would say it's a mark of violence against Mother Earth and against her children.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. I think the 30 by 30 is just another manifestation of colonialism for us, right? And it's just another land grab. I think that it it's really funny when you point out the contradictions of like the Biden campaign in international, the other nation states naming that they want to preserve and protect 30% of the world's waters and lands, right, by 2030. And yet, on the other hand, they are still approving, all of these leases. They are still fast tracking these things. They are skipping and bypassing processes that exist. They're stripping the EPA of rights and the ability to even act and do the things that they're meant to do, which is protect, right? They're continuing to do those things. And so it's like they say one thing, but their actions are actually saying something else. And that's global. That's every nation state that we can actually like point to that is doing that, right? In the name of corporatism and capitalism, right? It's not them making those decisions, it's the corporations, right? And so it's really interesting when we do that. Also, like 30 by 30, it's like, did they actually like speak to Indigenous peoples? Did they actually incorporate them? Did they incorporate very many people of color that they weren't tokenizing? Right. And so I think like it's a joke when we think about it in that context and when we're able to name the actual blaring contradictions that exist. And so I don't think that there's any fuel there. And in fact, like since the concept came out was just something that we just put to the side as not something that's a real solution, but just something that actually appeases people and prevents us from actually doing the work and actually moving forward on solutions that will work for us, right? And so it's one of those things that's like it's like a smoke screen. It just distracts us from what we really need to be doing, right?
Thank you both. Yeah. And the whole idea of setting aside 30% of the planet while continuing to extract and pollute the rest of the planet is just on its face ridiculously contradictory and destructive. But then, as you've both detailed, the implications in terms of dispossession and forms of violence against people all around the world are really shocking. So, as the crisis ramps up, so we get these outrageous proposed solutions. I have one question about resistance, and then we'll open up to questions from audience members. And I guess, I'm thinking about ways in which movements can work with one another across geographical and cultural differences of various different kinds. Because as I mentioned, the 30 by 30 was put forward through the United Nations, through this parallel conference to the climate conference, which, is a kind of elite effort to react to the climate crisis. There's an elite effort to react to the biodiversity crisis. And of course, those things are quite nicely connected, right? Because, you have a climate crisis because of carbon emissions. And you can solve it by preserving biodiversity, which is going to absorb all those carbon emissions. That's how it's all pitched, right? But we've heard that makes absolutely no sense on so many levels. So how are movements working with one another, and what kinds of connections and efforts are you particularly excited about, both of you, in terms of resisting these kinds of grabs, these kinds of green grabs?
Can jump in first this time, Nnimmo.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think from the earliest of days when I started to organize, I've always known that my people only represent 1% of the US's population. So in any fight that we pick up, like statistically, our chances of winning are super small, right? Just by the sheer numbers, right? And the fact that exists there. I've always known that when we take up these fights, it has to be intersectional and it has to be international. There's no way. The other thing is like, it's just common sense. It's just like the understanding of like tactic and strategy is like, there are Indigenous communities globally that have fought corporations and won against those corporations that maybe I am now fighting in my community. Right. And so really it's like common to like know if we want to develop tactic and strategy, then let's go to the folks that have already fought this fight and let's learn from them. Right. So that's just like really simple when we look at it. But I also think that when we look at intersectional campaigns, we have to know that like environmental justice is not just environmental justice. It's Indigenous rights. It's anti-Zionism, right? It's anti-racism. It's all of these things. It's the fact that right now we are watching global genocides happen in real time for extraction and exploitation, right? so that way we can gain more resources from the land, so we can violate her even more for profit. And we are willing to witness and observe and allow active genocides in the Congo, in Palestine, Sudan happen in the name of profit and exploitation and extraction, right? So our fights are not singular, they are not siloed. Our fights actually have to be intersectional, and we have to learn how to organize and resist at those intersections, right? We have to be able to see each other. We have to understand that militarism is a key factor. The US military is one of the largest polluters in the world, not just in the so-called US, the world. Where do we see the US military? How many bases exist across the world, right? How much money do we pump into our military budget as the so-called US? Where do we see them at, right? And so it's important that we understand that these struggles, these fights, if we are going to have an earth that's inhabitable, period, they have to be intersectional, right? I'm really excited about campaigns that are coming up. My organization, Honor the Earth, is getting ready to launch some stuff around no green colonialism. So what we've been doing so far in the so-called US is identifying all of the green transition mines that are proposed and that have been initiated so far. And we have a whole tracker of all of them. We've done that research, we've done that legwork, and now we're in the process of contacting every Indigenous nation that these mines will be next to or on, and giving them a heads up so that way they know that they can resist this, they can fight this, and that we will be there right there with them every step of the way. And then what we plan to do from that place is build a coalition. Again, there are folks, Indigenous relatives globally, that have already fought and resisted some of these corporations. So if we can actually connect and we can build relationship and we can learn from each other and we can actually have each other's back on those front lines, we can be a much more powerful force, right? What happens whenever we bring in Indigenous peoples, we bring in people that are anti-war, anti-militarism, we bring in anti-Zionist folks, we bring in the folks that actually are doing this work, right? And we work on an intersectional level that doesn't allow us to negate our own struggles and commitments, but that actually finds the connection and the connective thread that weaves us all together, right? Which is a very Indigenous way of looking at things, because Indigenous peoples, we know that everything is connected, right? We know that we are all related. And so therefore our resistance should also reflect that, right? I'll name No Green Colonialism campaign coming out of my organization, but I'll also name the Maersk campaign coming out of the Palestinian youth movement. So our relatives in Palestine really doing the legwork of understanding that there are ships that are actually shipping these things to different nations, right? They are basically the infrastructure that is allowing what is happening to happen. And so Maersk is a Dutch-owned logistics company and corporation. They are global. They are also responsible for shipping the majority of the arms from the so-called US globally, right? And where do we think that those arms are going? They're actually going to Indigenous lands that are resisting exploitation and extraction, right? And so it's like when we can get down to those details, then we can actually resist in a real way. And that's very intersectional. So just calling out the Maersk campaign, shouting out PYM, also shouting out our own campaign around no green colonialism.
Thank you so much, Krystal. I completely agree with what you said. I should just add that solidarity is so important for campaigns to succeed, because even within the countries, we have some peculiarities in different locations, and then within regions, and of course across the planet, continents of the world. And sometimes we don't. There's a tendency to think that what we are confronting is very peculiar, and it's not. There's nothing similar to it somewhere else. But when you look in detail, when you pay attention, you find that there are a lot of similarities. First of all, we're all human beings. I was listening to an analyst one day saying that there's a group of people somewhere in the world who are used to being exploited, that they don't mind being exploited. I said, this is absolute nonsense. There's no human being anywhere on planet Earth who is comfortable with being exploited, who believes that it's just there to be exploited. So there's always resistance within every society. And some of the best lessons I've learned in the struggle over the years have been working with people from other continents, especially from Indigenous communities, either in the global north or in other parts of the global south, because you need to find the commonalities, find the ideas that you can escalate in your own context, so you can adapt in your context. And then when you share your own concerns, you find that there is empathy, there's understanding, and that other people can feel what you are feeling, because it's very dangerous if you stand alone. And in fact, it's like dancing alone in a room. Nobody can, you dancing alone in a room, you wouldn't even know if you're dancing well or not. You need to have somebody else with you who would say, oh, well, you are making the right moves, or this is not the way to go. And then the struggle is the same way. That is why solidarity has been characterized as love on the street. On the street, you are not alone on the street. You march on the street, you are protesting on the street, you are demanding some things, and people, all of you are moving together in a show of love, maybe crying, maybe laughing, maybe just having a good time. But being out together is so empowering. And sometimes, of course, people get surprised. I remember in the 90s, I had visitors from across the world. There was somebody, a particular friend from another part of Africa. We took him around the Niger Delta, they saw the level of pollution, and he said, well, if I came from here, I would have been a revolutionary. And another friend who was from Latin America said, well, you are not right. If you are careful to observe the objective conditions that is reigning wherever you're coming from, you have no option but to be a revolutionary. So if you're not a revolutionary back home, it means you are not observant, you're not taking note of what is going on around you. And so working together in solidarity is so critical and cannot be overlooked. This is why also we need to stand up against militarism. The amount of money being spent on warfare by rich countries amount to more than $2 trillion a year. What is needed for climate action in a year is less than that amount. Yet the money cannot be found to build resilience, but there's money for destruction. It just doesn't make sense. The world has to come back to common sense that we are together on this planet. I know there's some efforts to make colonies in space, but that may not, how many people can escape to Mars or to the moon to live up there? Yet billions of dollars are being spent about finding where people could move to in space. We got to get back our senses. Remember to come back as members of the same circle, to struggle for a sane planet, to live in harmony and in solidarity.
Thank you so much to you both. I think we have Steve Lyons back with us with some audience questions.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your contributions to this panel. It's been such an exciting conversation. So there are 18 or more questions in the chat. So we're in the Q&A. So we're not going to get to all of them, but there's a few big buckets that people have been kind of like engaging with that I'm sort of seeing coming out through this. So one thing, and this would be returning to some of our earlier questions, is people have a bit of curiosity about some more details about how these green colonial schemes actually work. So like do the blue carbon companies who buy carbon credits by grabbing all of these forests, et cetera, prevent any more mining of these areas for oil or minerals? These kinds of, basically, how do these work in practice? So that's one bucket that people are really interested in thinking about. And another that I think is really relevant to what your most recent responses place and might be a great place to end, is people looking for affirmative visions of a future beyond these cycles of colonial dispossession, right? Visions that give us hope. So we've discussed now how our analysis of the problem, which is to say seeing how systems of capitalist extraction, militarism, et cetera, can help us see across geographic difference, right? To see the commonalities and the forms of possible solidarity that can appear beyond geographic distance. But the question of an affirmative vision or hope remains, right? So one anonymous attendee asks, what are your favorite visions for a future of all life on Earth? And I think Krystal's offered land back as an affirmative vision for hope. So this is perhaps an opportunity to elaborate on how the kinds of place-based movements and political projects that you support can, in aggregate and in combination, rival, or beat back the kinds of neocolonial visions that are so grand, like 30 by 30, and that have so much money and backing behind them. So like, and I think that that's really a great place to end. And I think that it's possible, and I think we're all here because we think it's possible. So with that, maybe I'll pitch it back to all y'all and see if you have anything that resonates with that.
Well, that's a whole lot of reflections to make, and I'm glad that there's so much engagement in the conversation. I wish we had more time, but of course, that's a big question. How does green colonialism work out in practice? There are very many ways this is playing out right now, apart from all the false solutions are basically emanating from green colonialism, because it's all ways of avoiding action. Ways of colonizing territories, colonizing nature's resources, the gift of nature to us, and avoiding the real climate action. That is why the whole debate about the enthronement of market environmentalism has created a lot of difficulties for us all, because upon all the voluntary climate actions being taken by governments, the problem is not being dented at all. And the temperature increase is going beyond what the Paris Agreement envisaged. And let me just give 2 examples about why green colonialism. And so a lot of books have been written on these topics, one of which is The Geopolitics of Green Colonialism, which was just published by Pluto Press. I think that is something good to look at. And we've all heard about the extraction of critical minerals. Millions of people are being displaced in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, because of not just the violence of, the violence in Congo is not just because people like to fight each other. It's about extractivist spaces. People are looking to get control of extraction. And this is what is really heightening the crisis in the world today. Wherever you look, wherever there's war, if you look behind it very closely, there's one interest in extractivist interest somewhere, lurking behind somewhere, because capital thrives on extractivism, and extractivism is subtraction, never addition. So it doesn't really add value to anyone's life. So critical minerals are called critical so that we could say, okay, this is what is needed and must be obtained. That's what they call critical. When you look at the language itself, we're not being told that this is not so much about green minerals or something that we're going to bring something different, but something that is critically needed at this time if we're going to escape the climate crisis. So why don't you allow us to do it without any restraint, without any control? And this is really crazy. Then the other thing is about the fact that green energy resources are not neutral. They're still being controlled by big corporations. They're still about control and power, so that the transition may happen, but justice would not be in it. We have issues in some territories where indigenous lands are being grabbed for massive wind farms or solar arrays, solar panel arrays, solar farms. And then the communities that own that territory are no discussion with them. They don't even have access to the power that's being generated. We have issues like this when you look at Western Sahara, which is being colonized by Morocco. Their territory is being utilized for some of this. Part of the Sahara Desert is being utilized for this without regard to those who own the territory, own in quotes, and who live there, who depend on the resources of nature in those territories. This is very clear examples of green colonialism, because it allows the land itself to be grabbed. And then there is this solution, there is another false solution about hydrogen. You have different kinds of hydrogen: green hydrogen, turquoise hydrogen, brown hydrogen, red, all kinds of hydrogen. And the green one is the most sexy of them all. Green hydrogen is produced by using renewable energy. And here's some people planning to invest in production of green hydrogen in my country. They will use potable water. We don't have sufficient access to clean water in my country. They will use solar power. We have access to very little electricity in my country. Don't mind that my screen has not gone dark. It could go off at any time. We don't have that yet. Somebody wants to harness our sun, take our water, produce hydrogen, split the water to hydrogen, and then ship it to Europe. Crazy idea. Why don't you do that in Europe? Why must we come to do it in Africa? This is at the tentacles of the same colonial mentality and colonial extractivism, which is being perpetuated under the umbrella of green energy. So green colonialism is well and alive, and we just can't, I mean, it's just crazy. So there's so many examples about how this is happening in practice.
Nnimmo, thanks very much. And we will turn it over to Krystal to have the last word for the panel. But as we're shutting things down, I wanted to thank you both again for your extremely brilliant and important words and interventions, and for the incredible work you're doing.
Yeah, briefly, I know we're getting close to time, but briefly, just echoing what Nnimmo shared, the way that we're seeing it play out here in the so-called US is really just around the fact that these mines, the minerals that are needed are on Indigenous lands, are within a 35-mile radius. And so rather than consulting in like getting consent from Indigenous peoples and the folks that are actually on those territories and from those lands, it's just you declare eminent domain and you pump federal dollars into it and you just do what you want to do regardless in the name of the profit, right? And so we're seeing that happen, but examples of that we're seeing happen right now is Thacker Pass, which is a lithium mine. And that's part of the Shoshone-Paiute territories. They're actively resisting right now, and it's really an ugly fight. The Talon campaign in Minnesota, which will be a nickel and cobalt mine. We're seeing a refinery being built in so-called Oklahoma, which is also territory to many different Indigenous nations, but it's deemed a sacrifice zone. We're willing to sacrifice Oklahoma and the lands there and the peoples there in the name of green energy. And so a cobalt mine by Westwind Elements is being presented there. It'll be the first one in the so-called US that is ever in existence, and it will be on Indigenous lands, right? We're seeing Rio Tinto down in Oak Flat in Arizona. We're seeing the Apache peoples resist that and have been resisting that for a very long time, basically building out copper mines over the top of traditional territories and ceremonial grounds for the Apache peoples. And so we're watching these mines spring up everywhere. And so it's really interesting to see that the goal is more electric cars for everybody, right, here in the so-called US, and that it's a very elitist thing as well, because it's based on the money and access to money and privilege. And those that have access, those that have privilege are the ones that have electric cars, versus the folks whose lands are actually being mined at the present are the ones that don't have access to those cars, right? So why are we focusing on the individual versus the collective, when maybe an electric train that actually crosses the entire so-called US is something that's more productive and actually reduces the amount of emissions that individuals make, and it's something that serves the public and the greater good, right, and reduces our demand on the actual mining itself. My point there is to name that right now we are in a morals and a values crisis. What we value or what we spend our time and our money on is what we value, right? And that's what we're seeing right now. And that is not just as the so-called US and the government and the inflated military budget, but that is actually a reflection of us as individuals and what we are willing to spend our money and our time on. And we have to ask ourselves, what do we value? Where are we going to actually truly choose to invest our time, invest our money, invest our energy in? Right? And that is something for every individual to think about. And that is something that is reflected in our politicians. And that's something that's reflected in our US government that is supposed to represent us, but does not. Right? And so I think that all of it is a question for individuals and for us as people to say what we value. Right? And we need a major shift in that. There's much more to be said, but we're definitely wrapping up here and at the end of things. So I'll just end on that, and just to say, again, emphasizing the intersectionality and the morals and the values and what we invest our time in.
Thank you so much, Krystal. So it's been an absolutely amazing panel. We've had some incredible ideas and possibilities put forward. And I'll again thank the team at the Natural History Museum for making this possible, and turn it back over to y'all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Nnimmo and Krystal. We are gonna close the floor with one last contribution and invite Nnimmo to share one of his poems. And then I'll let you know about the next event in the series. So please, Nnimmo.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read a poem from my collection titled, the collection is called I See the Invisible, and this poem is titled Horizon. The horizon never leaves, yet even at full throttle, even on full solar tanks, none could reach her. The horizon never leaves, yet she's so aloof. Even when the sky kisses the sea, none could grasp her. The horizon is never rough. Her perfect curve, the arc of her back, none could find a toehold. The horizon is never uncertain. Constant as the northern star, she dances on the edges of her eyes. None could ignore her. The horizon is loudly clear. Even on misty days, she is there, wedged on our imagination. She is the eternal lighthouse.
Thank you, Nnimmo. That was just beautiful and a perfect note to close us out on, a hopeful note. So I want to thank all of our panelists, all of you for coming. We have people tuning in from around the world. More than 700 people registered for the event and the recording. We would love your feedback. The poll has popped up on your computer. We'll also be emailing a survey out. Do let us know what you think so that we can keep improving. We will also be sharing the recording and the chat transcript from this event. So it'll be posted on the naturalhistorymuseum.org within a few days. And we will also email that around. Please don't miss the next event in our series. It's on August 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern, called Aquifer Defenders, Learning from Wadukawag Amikwag. It's curated by critical geographer and Red Natural History Fellow Kai Bosworth. And the event's going to dive into the ongoing pipeline monitoring work that Wadukawag Amikwag, or those who help beaver, are doing. They are a multicultural group made up of water protectors, credentialed scientists, licensed drone pilots, field monitors, and grassroots organizers working around Line 3 and beyond. I want to thank our sponsors, Luz Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, and For Culture for supporting this series, Natural History for a World in Crisis, and also thank our event team at the Natural History Museum and Alluvium Gatherings. If you enjoyed this event, you can learn more about the Natural History Museum and sign up for our email list at thenaturalhistorymuseum.org. And we are now going to close you out with Son of the Sun by the Micmac songwriter and activist Willie Dunn.
Son of the sun, son of the earth, the soul of life, children of the world, daughters of starlight, daughters of mirth, sisters of sunlight, sisters of earth, brothers of nature, brothers of old, brothers of legend, and the story untold. I had a dream of my Lakota. They laid to rest with a gun and a sword, buried the hatchet, buried the snake, vowed to each other peace to make. The earth supplies and nature feeds, but we turn and quake for artificial needs. Come down to earth and stay a while. The sun is shining, just sit there and smile. I'm a brown-skinned man, that's what I am. Got a guitar and a drum, that's where I come from. Spirit of the sun, spirit of the sea, worthy of the shadow, come shining down on me. Son of the sun, son of the earth, soul of life, children of the word, brothers of nature, brothers of old, brothers of legend, and the story untold. Daughters of starlight, daughters of mirth, sisters of sunlight, sisters of earth. I had a dream of mild and cold. They laid to rest with gun and a sword. They buried the hatchet, they buried the snake. Bow to each other, peace to make. Oh, son of the sun,